Now, some have left us and some have joined us, and so we welcome our colleague Patrice Brodeur, who this time, last Friday, left for Nigeria. And here he is. So I think a round of applause, actually, for somebody who managed to do that. Welcome, I'm glad you could make it. So, according to the schedule, we're going to just breathe and spend some time thinking about what it was that we accomplished, if anything, yesterday in terms of the various reflections that were given and how they might pertain, generally speaking, to our understandings of phobia with regards to Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism. When I went back home and I tried to put everything together, because I couldn't go to sleep, too much had happened, I just went through the papers one by one in my own mind, and I realized just how thankful I was to you, Shannon, for this. It's probably not even your notion, but if it is, forgive me, but the notion of duty of care. It's just a lovely way of framing things that we don't think of often enough, this business of care. In religious terms, and I'm going to translate, I would immediately just see this in terms of covenantal obligations, and to see this as chesed, as steadfast loving kindness. And so in my rapport, in my dealings with other people, how is that coming out? But I also like this notion of fearing badly and fearing, and the difference between that and fearing better together. But I was a little bit confused, because I thought about how it is that I've been in situations where people were afraid, and sometimes it can feed on itself, and then it increases the phobia. But nevertheless, I like the idea of fearing better together. The trajectories, of course, we were reminded of phobias are so complex. It doesn't really matter whether you're just looking at them historically, but now, as Professor Esposito indicated to us, we're looking at things globally, and so we're having to say to ourselves, Islamophobia doesn't work out the same way, whether it be here in North America, whether it be here in Canada, or in Europe, or in some of the African states, in China, etc., and the kinds of horrific things that are happening there that we actually, more often than not, don't even hear about, because our newspapers are filled with all kinds of other things. And so I was so grateful, Amir, for your ending of showing us that this is here are those whose faith is Islam in America, and look at the breadth of it, look at the depth of it, and the difference, and how much that has gone into making what it is that any of us would want to be able to speak of as American society. I was impressed also with a number of us who spoke about the need to model how we discuss, how we talk about things. It doesn't even matter just simply whether it's in an academic forum, although of course it does matter, but it seems that we are incapable or not very good any longer at dialogue. Dialogue always presumes change. In other words, if you're going into the dialogue, and I'll speak as a Christian, and you think that your purpose is to convert everyone, forget it. This is not what dialogue is about. The dialogue is to listen carefully as to what it was that you didn't hear properly the first time anyways, and in that process you change, and as you change, somebody else changes with you. So this business of how it is that the story is told to the next generation becomes really very important. And with that then goes, well, how is it that we communicate? What are the means in which people and youngsters now communicate? And does it make a difference that everything is going on WhatsApp or Facebook or going back and forth in using those medias? I don't have a problem with them. I really don't. I'm not quite sure or convinced that somehow or another this feeds or fuels phobic responses any more than at any other time. It may simply be that ideas are able to be transmitted much quicker and over far larger spaces of areas of geographic areas, something that we're not used to. But in terms of the violence, I can't think of anything more violent than Kristallnacht. But there was no social media that brought everybody together and purposed that kind of violence. But certainly, how do we talk to one another? And that also then led, but perhaps we didn't talk about it straight on, to the issue of when is it appropriate to try to cancel somebody else's ideas? Or is it ever appropriate? We didn't really hit that, but we didn't skirt around it either. It just came up. Anyways, those are my reflections on it late at a night. And I want to thank you all for the papers. We're now in our third session, and I leave the floor to you.
So I welcome you all to this probably the last session of our conference. We have three very distinguished speakers whom I have had the privilege of knowing for several decades now, all of them. So it is a matter of great delight to me that I am moderating this session. I will introduce the first speaker now, Professor Jeffery Long. I'm trying to dig out the short speech I should have about his background. But as I do that, I would like to mention that he is one of the earliest scholars I know of who identified the phenomenon of Hinduphobia and tried to investigate it analytically. He is the Carl Ziegler Professor of Religious Studies at Elizabethtown University. He is the author of several books, one on Jainism, which I use myself extensively, and then a book on religion, I beg your pardon, Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific. He has another book on Hinduism in America, and another book of his is due to appear early next year on, could you remind me of the title? Of Discovering Indian Philosophy. So I now request Professor Long to address us.
Thank you very much, Avanji, for your kind welcome. Namaste, everyone. Good afternoon. And I just want to say how grateful I am to have been invited to be part of this conference and part of this conversation. I'm going to begin by giving kind of an overview or background of the theoretical perspective and the values-informed perspective that I'm taking. Some of what I say may just be obvious to everyone because of the conversations we've been having over the last day or two, but I think it's still worth discussing. This topic of Hinduphobia, the very use of the word is so controversial that I discovered yesterday apparently a number of scholars have written to the university wanting us to not have this gathering because of that. And those who were here yesterday saw after Suhak Shukla's presentation, someone from the audience really objected very strongly and sort of was making a statement about that. I think in this charged environment, it's therefore very important to be just super clear about what our assumptions are, the perspective we're coming from, the background we're coming from. I want to note that this is very much a work in progress, and in fact, I've even changed the title already in my mind of my presentation. My presentation says, Moving from Fear and Hatred to Acceptance and Mutual Respect, Identifying and Combating Hinduphobia. I've decided I don't like the word combating. It's too combative. I would like to replace that with dispelling Hinduphobia, right? I'd like to see it blow away on the breeze of knowledge, right? That's what I would like to see happen. So I would like to begin with a quote from Alfred North Whitehead, and those of you who know me are forewarned. Whenever you invite me to speak anywhere, you're going to hear a quote from Whitehead and a quote from Swami Vivekananda. So we begin with the Whitehead quote, and many, many years ago, I actually put this as an epigram on my doctoral dissertation. Whitehead says, "Must religion always be a synonym for hatred? The great social ideal for religion is that it should be the common basis for the unity of civilization." Of course, immediately one wants to object, which civilization, which religion? I would like to think that in the globalized world that we now all inhabit, and given Whitehead's various other commitments, that he's speaking very broadly, that religion as such, religiosity, that all the great traditions can in some sense be foundational for a global civilization, not one torn apart by hatred and violence. My next hero that I want to invoke is Swami Vivekananda. For those of you who are unfamiliar with him, he was the first Hindu teacher to come to North America and gather a considerable following. He established the first Vedanta Society in New York in 1894. A year before that, he spoke at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago. I want to also mention that the tradition in which I practice, the Hinduism that I profess, is the tradition that he taught and established. It was brought to the West specifically with Westerners in mind. It was something that made Hindu thought and practice accessible to people like myself, and this is the tradition in which I'm situated. So on September 11th, and now everyone gets nervous as soon as I say September 11th, on September 11th, 1893, Swami Vivekananda said the following: "Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant, fanaticism, have long possessed this beautiful earth. They've filled the earth with violence, drenched it often and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for these horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now." He was speaking to the crowd at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago. His welcome address, right, a very famous address, he began by saying, "Sisters and brothers of America," and that gesture of warmth and friendship from someone from a country who was at that time under the heel of colonialism, and a brown-skinned person saying this to a mostly white audience in America, where slavery was still a living memory, and his speaking as an equal, as a member of a tradition outside of Christianity, it greatly moved the crowd. I mean, they rose and they gave him an ovation just after his first sentence. So this is from the conclusion of the famous Sisters and Brothers of America speech. And he identifies here, I think, what we can think of as really the three enemies of humanity: sectarianism, our tendency to want to identify only with those who agree with us. I think today we might say tribalism, but he's identifying specifically religious tribalism or sectarianism. Bigotry, of course, and fanaticism, right? Holding a view in such an extreme way that even conversation about alternatives is not possible. Right? Only my way is correct. These states of being, these states of consciousness, rather than any particular religious community, nor religion itself, I want to argue, is to blame for human suffering, right? The phobias we're talking about locate the problem with the world in those people, whoever they may be, right? Whether we're talking about Hinduism or Islam or Judaism or Christianity or whatever tradition we're referring to, when we identify a tradition and a community as evil, I want to say we have erred in that regard. Each religion, if we are really honest and objective, look at the history of religions around the world, at their best, they all teach peace, love, and compassion for our fellow beings, our fellow human beings, and often our fellow non-human beings, and the planet itself. Each religion at its best has served as a catalyst for some of the greatest of humanity's intellectual, moral, and artistic achievements. The promotion of the true, the good, and the beautiful, I want to put forward, is the ideal of religion. Tragically, not an ideal always realized. Tragically, all too often, we find ourselves going in the exact opposite direction. But this is why I say religion at its best is actually promoting these things. And this is true of every tradition. At the same time, because of the ways in which it's bound up with both our individual identity, our ego, our sense of self, and our collective identity, our sense of community, our sense of belonging to a group. Religion is highly vulnerable to the forces of sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism, because these all emerge when we fear for the safety and the integrity of either ourselves or our group. This is why I think the suffix phobia is very effective and very appropriate for the kinds of biases against different traditions that we're talking about. I'll say more in a bit about why the term Hinduphobia has become controversial, but many people will say, we're not talking about fear, we're talking about hatred. On a Vedantic analysis of the phenomenon of hatred from the perspective of Swami Vivekananda's tradition, at the root of hatred, always there is actually some fear. Right? We hate that which we fear. If something is not going to harm us at all, we're not going to hate it, right? Someone might dislike the flavor of a particular food, let's say. They might say, oh, I hate that. But they don't really hate it. They're not going to try to, I'm not fond of cauliflower. I'm not going to try to destroy all the cauliflower in the world. I just don't want to eat it, right? But hatred comes from fear, right? And that fear is really the root cause, the root problem we need to address. These tendencies must be resisted wherever they emerge. In the religions of others, yes, we should be able to critique other religions. That doesn't mean we're being phobic. That doesn't mean we hate them. It can be done lovingly and out of concern. In our own religion or community, I think we have a duty to oppose fanaticism, bigotry, and sectarianism. But most fundamentally, within our own self. Right? One of the most moving of many moving experiences I had at the conference yesterday was a gentleman sitting near the front right now got up and said something very honest about the difficulty he had not hating and feeling kindly toward a particular group, a particular tradition, because of historical things that have happened and are still happening to his own community. That honesty with ourselves is really where we have to start. I am very resistant to the demonization of any group, even the people who are doing harm, right? Those people who are doing harm, we think, okay, if we destroy them, everything will be okay. But they have families, and they have relatives, and they have people who are looking on, who will then harden their own attitudes, and the struggle continues, right? The aim is not to identify this is a bad group of people. What we have here is a set of bad attitudes that we need to correct. So this is my theoretical framework, such as it is, from which I approach these issues. We all have the capacity to be sectarian, bigoted, and fanatical, and we all have the capacity to cultivate acceptance and mutual respect. I'm emphasizing acceptance and not tolerance quite deliberately. Swami Vivekananda found the idea of tolerance quite abhorrent. He didn't like intolerance, but he said very famously, tolerance means I am allowing you to live. Right? I'm going to put up with you, even though I don't really like you. Now, to be sure, that may be the bare minimum necessary for a peaceful society. It's certainly better than intolerance. But the ideal, the goal, is acceptance. I will often ask my students when I present this material to them, I'll say, if you went back to your dormitory today and your roommate said to you, I tolerate you, how would you feel? Would you feel welcomed? Would you feel safe in that room? So how do people feel in a society where they are merely tolerated? Right? Our goal is acceptance. Now, who am I to talk about all of this? Why is this white guy up here talking about Hinduphobia, right? To put it very bluntly. So, as many have done in the conference, I'm going to do a little bit of some personal self-disclosure. I've already mentioned I'm part of the tradition of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda. I was not always there, though. I was born in the Catholic faith, grew up in a small town in Missouri called Montgomery City. If you haven't heard of it, I forgive you. When I was quite young, my father was in a devastating accident. I was 10 years old at the time. He passed away a couple of years later as a result of what happened to him in the accident. This was a horrifically traumatic event for me and for my family. And it was a very formative age, and I became deeply interested in the questions of the afterlife, hence the book on reincarnation. I became deeply preoccupied with questions of meaning. Why do we suffer? Is there a purpose to all of this? And hence my interest in religion, and eventually pursuing a career studying religion. But when I started asking questions and studying various traditions, I sort of made as broad a study as I could of the world's religions. I found many answers to my questions which were very reassuring to me in the faith of my upbringing. But there are some questions that I didn't feel were adequately answered there. The tradition that really drew me was the Hindu tradition. And I came across a copy of the Bhagavad Gita when I was 14. It was in, of all places, at a flea market in the parking lot of the Methodist Church in the town where I grew up. I bought it for $0.25, and it changed my life. It was really a book that changed my life. And its teaching about the nature of self, the nature of the afterlife, the nature of our relationship to the divine, was something I found very compelling. And so I continued in my interest. I went to college at University of Notre Dame. I studied theology there, went to University of Chicago to study religion, and met my wife there, who grew up in the Hindu tradition. She is, as she describes herself, an Indian teaching Japanese in the United States. We have the good fortune of teaching in the same college together. And I have become fully absorbed into the Hindu community in the United States, specifically in the Vedanta Society, but more broadly as well. We have the Hindu temple where I'm a regular member. I've served on its board of trustees. So I'm very grateful to the extent to which I've been accepted in this community. I don't claim to speak for it. I don't claim to speak for all Hindus. I'm here speaking just as myself. But this is where I'm coming from. So a Hindu, but kind of an unusual Hindu, I think. So what is this Hinduphobia we are talking about? So in Suhag Shukla's presentation yesterday, she gave a very nicely worked out definition that several of us have been involved in developing. I'm going to provide a shorter one here. It's just an irrational fear and hatred of Hindus and Hinduism. My argument is that it's more widespread and more deeply embedded in Western society than is commonly acknowledged. What I'm stating here is not a conspiracy theory, but it's something that if you become a practitioner in this tradition and you become attuned to it, you notice all the ways in which, even the way people sometimes speak, will show a very different set of assumptions from those that are held in the Hindu tradition. Now that doesn't equate to Hinduphobia, obviously, but an environment has been created by Western culture in which things like the use of images in worship, to name just one example, are viewed with great discomfort by many people. And there is a kind of fear and aversion of that. And I recognize this phobia because I experienced it as a Catholic also. There is anti-Catholicism still very strong in the United States, much more so 100 years ago, but it's still present. I had a great aunt who was fired from a teaching job back in the 1920s because it was discovered that she was Catholic, and my grandmother could recall the Ku Klux Klan burning a cross in front of the Catholic Church in our town when she was a little girl. So if you grow up Catholic, you get attuned to certain tropes, certain things that make you feel different and excluded. And many of the same ones apply to Hinduism, interestingly. There are even respected scholars, I have to say, who have denied the existence of Hinduphobia, and again, even gone so far as to object to there being a conference with the term there. Why is that? Why is that? Well, there is the phenomenon of what's called Hindu nationalism. Sometimes you hear the term Hindutva. And there is the current political order in India, the current government of India, to which many people object and to which many people have taken issue. And I have to say, I'm not on board with Hindu nationalism personally. And as Suhag Shukla said herself yesterday, I think in a democracy, in a pluralistic society, you cannot have a government of one religion because it's going to then marginalize anyone who's not part of that. And if you're a Hindu in the United States or in Canada, you're aware of what it is to be a minority. And so that same empathy should be there for minorities in India. This is my strong belief. However, there are people who respond to criticism of the government of India by saying, that's Hinduphobia. And because of that, there are scholars who are critical of that government who have said, there's no Hinduphobia, this is a smokescreen for people who want to deflect criticism of Narendra Modi and the BJP and so on. And that, I think, is a mistake. Because yes, while people do misuse the term in that way, to then deny that Hindus experience bigotry and experience prejudice is to deny their pain, right? It's to deny the trauma. It's to deny a real hurt that is going on. And in fact, there is a field manual on Hindu nationalism that was developed by some scholars who are very sharply critical of it. And in one section, they talk about Hinduphobia, and they actually say, Hindus do experience discrimination and prejudice, but it's not full stop, right? They then go on to say, but, it's not genocide, so why should we use this term Hinduphobia, right? This is really a downplaying of the phenomenon. Now, to be sure, if you're Hindu in the United States or Canada, you're not facing genocide. And more than 99% of the time, you're not facing any physical threat to your livelihood. But bigotry, nevertheless, is real, and people nevertheless experience it, and we know from history that it can easily mutate into much worse things, right? So I think that being dismissive of anyone's pain is never a good strategy, right? So this is, I disagree with my fellow scholars. I understand why they've taken that stance. There's an extent to which I agree and see their point. But the misuse of a term does not mean that term is completely without applicability. I think we can reclaim the term Hinduphobia if we're talking about some of the phenomena that I'm going to be discussing today. This particular prejudice is rooted in two things, primarily. One, racism. I'm talking, by the way, today about my own context in the United States. Obviously, in India, racism is not a factor in Hinduphobia. Everyone's Indian, right? Now, there actually are many different ethnic groups in South Asia, but it doesn't play into this topic of Hinduphobia. But in the Western world, yes, very much. And then religious bigotry, right? Opposition to Hinduism on religious ground. It's also tied to and found in tandem with Islamophobia, as well as fear and hatred of members of the Sikh faith. I don't know if a term for that has been coined, Sikhophobia maybe, or Sikhphobia. And this is, I think, a very significant fact, which I want to come back to. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about the contemporary character and also the historical roots of Hinduphobia. And I want to at least begin to chart a course toward solving this problem, right? Dissolving this problem, dispelling Hinduphobia through cultivating greater understanding of Hinduism and the religious traditions of India more generally, and promoting empathy across cultural, ethnic, and religious boundaries. Many ideals and practices which have come to be cherished in the contemporary West have roots in the Hindu tradition, of which most people are unaware. There's a lot of influence of Hindu thought on the United States and its culture. And people very often are unaware of the history of that influence and where it has come from. Drawing attention to these aspects, as well as is also part of the larger solution, I think, to this problem of contemporary Western society. So what's the contemporary character of Hinduphobia? Now, Suhag spoke a bit about this yesterday. It was her main topic, so I won't dwell too long on this, but it's of two basic kinds. There is Hinduphobia from the wider Western society. That's really my main focus. This is the Hinduphobia that has existed in Western society and with which Hindus in the United States and in Canada have had to contend historically, rooted in racism and religious bigotry. And more recently, there's Hinduphobia in the context of conflicts within the Indian and broader South Asian immigrant community. So there are lines of conflict between Hindus and other religious communities that have immigrated to the West. Hindus and Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, and conflicts internal to the Hindu community over issues such as caste. These complex issues are beyond the scope of what I have time to discuss today. They involve substantive, historical, and political concerns and grievances. But these expressions can easily slide into religious phobia, right? Because someone might be offering a legitimate criticism of a particular tradition, and very quickly the conversation degenerates into an attack on the entire tradition, right? So someone says, well, I'm opposed to Hindu nationalism, but then pretty soon they're saying, Hinduism is the problem, right? And we heard some examples of that yesterday. And so this is what we need to be attentive to when we have those kinds of conversations. But in terms of the historical character of Hinduphobia in North America, it's, again, been a blend of racism and religious bigotry. Where does the racism subsist? These are attacks. Racism manifests as attacks ranging from microaggressions to murder, right? And everything in between, directed against Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, and even Indian Christians, indiscriminately because of xenophobia, right? So here I'm talking about Hinduphobia as a subspecies of a broader, maybe we could call it Indophobia. And this, I think, has been the main source of pain and suffering for Hindus in the United States. Again, everything from microaggression to murder. And then you have religious bigotry. This manifests as coercion on the individual level, urging Hindus to convert to the majority religion, Christianity. I've experienced this personally. This is one reason why when people tell me Hinduphobia doesn't exist, I wonder if I'm living in the right reality. Vandalism of Hindu places of worship, sexualizing and casting moral aspersions on Hindu teachers. There's a beautiful documentary called Awake about the life of Paramahansa Yogananda. He's the famous author of Autobiography of a Yogi. He was driven almost to despair at one point in his career as a yoga teacher in the United States when newspapers began manufacturing stories about him and his women disciples. And so he almost went back to India and gave up because it was so hurtful. If you go all the way back to Swami Vivekananda, many of the newspaper reports about him are very sensationalizing, and they all talk about how handsome and good-looking he was, and the hordes of white female followers that he had. And the subtext here is not hard to see at all. It's really the text, actually. They're sexualizing a person who's devoted his life to sannyasa, to renunciation, to celibacy, and really sort of dragging the whole thing down in a very tawdry way. And we still see this in some writing on Hindu teachers, characterizing Hindu and Hindu-based organizations as cults, right? ISKCON was the first to really experience this a lot back in the 70s. Stereotyping and ridiculing Hindu practices and beliefs. And I think we can add equating all assertions of Hinduism with Hindu nationalism, right? This is sort of the newest one. But we heard it yesterday, right, in this room. Here's a very offensive headline from the early 20th century, exhibiting some of the racism I'm talking about. Indians in the U.S. of all religious affiliations have suffered from racism since immigration from India began in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Attacks on Indian Americans, mainly Sikhs and Muslims, in the American Northwest culminated in the Bellingham riots of 1907 and the passage by Congress of the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. Except for a small handful of students, from 1924 to 1964, if you were from India, China, Japan, you could not immigrate to the United States. People were banned from the United States. Again, most of the victims of the riots were Sikh, and most of them were, the victims of the Bellingham riots were loggers. A lot of the Sikhs and Muslims who were members of the British military in India, after their term of service, they would come to the US and also to Canada and work in the logging industry, earn a decent amount of money, and then go back home, get married, and settle down. They were viciously attacked, and they were called by their attackers Hindus, right? Often spelled Hindoo rather than Hindu. Yes, crowd numbering 500 drags dusky Orientals from their homes, right? This is our heritage. As I was writing about Hinduism in America for my book, I found rhetoric which I'm sad to say is echoed in that of the Republican Party of today in the United States. They take our jobs, they're different from us, they threaten our culture. This has not changed in 100 years. From congressional testimony leading to the passage of the Asian Exclusion Act, I invite you to either laugh or weep at the exchange you're about to see. This is about how this hatred attacks Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims indiscriminately, and in fact in a deep, dark sea of ignorance. This is from the testimony. Denver S. Church, one of the big advocates of Asian exclusion, he says, "They have their religion. In fact, it seems to be about all there is to a Hindu, his religion." The chairman then asked, "Is that the Mohammedan religion, right? Is that Islam?" As I understand, they didn't know the difference between Hinduism, Islam, Sikh. They had no idea. And what's more, they didn't care, really. And this is really what we have to understand, that this kind of hatred based on racism is not interested in the niceties of religious differences. I had my own experience with this a few years ago. I bought a washing machine and I promptly broke it. And so I had to have the repair person come, and very nice guy, but we had this conversation. He asked me what I did for a living. I said, "Oh, I teach at the college, and where I live, the college is Elizabethtown College." And he said, "Oh, what do you teach?" I said, "Oh, I teach religions of India, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and so." He said, "Oh, I'm surprised the government didn't hire you after 9/11. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, after those Hindus hit us on 9/11, and I was placed in the center of a moral dilemma because my first instinct was just to correct his, misperception about who did it. But then I realized if I just labeled another religion, that's equally wrong, because the vast majority of Muslims in the world who were not involved in 9/11 had no more to do with it than Hindus or Sikhs or Christians or anyone, right? So I kind of gave him a mini course on the world's religions as he repaired my washing machine. And at the end, he was very gracious. He thanked me and he said I could charge his boss for the free lesson that he got. But this ignorance is still pervasive, right? It's still pervasive. Dr. Prabhat Singh, a Sikh physician, was attacked brutally in New York in September 2013. His assailants referred to him repeatedly as Osama as they beat and kicked him. Here is Suresh Bhai Patel, a Hindu, attacked in Alabama in February 2015 by police officers who assailed him after he could not respond to their requests in English. He spoke only Gujarati and Hindi. He was there visiting his nephew, and his crime was walking through the neighborhood while Indian. Worst of all, I think, is the Oak Creek Massacre in Wisconsin. A gunman attacked the Sikh Gurdwara, the place of worship. 6 people were murdered, 4 were injured before he was stopped. He thought he was attacking a mosque. So you see these cases of the identification of the traditions not even being known to the assailant. Then you have the more overtly religious bigotry, which I guess we could call proper Hinduism. This is graffiti sprayed on the wall, in one of the inside walls of a Hindu temple in Kentucky a few years ago. Here we see from a Swaminarayan temple, also someone broke in and spray painted the eyes of the images with black paint. So these things still go on. So I want to close quickly. I think I'm getting close to my half-hour mark. But how do we go beyond fear and hatred to acceptance and mutual respect? Of course, this may be my bias as an educator, but I think education is essential. The fact that people don't even know who they're assaulting, and much less anything of detail about their traditions and all of the wonderful, rich things they contribute to society, this has to be known, right? The contributions of all communities have to be known. Interfaith friendships and cooperation. People need to get out of their comfort zone. They need to get to know people from various traditions. Work together on issues of common concern, climate change, even cleaning up the neighborhood, right? Things that these sort of micro acts that people can do where they develop bonds of friendship with people of diverse communities and their perspective changes on that tradition. Learning to listen. So quickly, we see, especially on social media, disagreement degenerates into really absolute hatred. How do we really understand the trauma of someone who's maybe saying something we disagree with deeply, but they're saying it because of something they've experienced, which needs to be addressed? If we address that, maybe we get to the root of their hatred. Going beyond tribalism, right? Finding the authentic core of the religious traditions. It's become a cliche now that you can find some version of the Golden Rule in just about every tradition. But you can find some version of the Golden Rule in just about every tradition, right? It's there. The teaching of empathy is there. The teaching of acceptance is there. And we have to address the traumas that's been experienced. We can't deny it. We can't say, oh, there's no Hinduphobia, there's no Islamophobia, that doesn't happen here, that doesn't happen in our neighborhood. It happens in all of us. So we have to address that. And so we turn then to our next speaker, but it's not my job to introduce him. I think I will hand the program back over to Dr. Sharma. I don't know if we have time. I've probably talked too long for questions, but I don't know, maybe there are questions.
No, I think we do have time for questions.
Okay.
Yeah. So we welcome any question you have of the speaker.
I always say if there are no questions, it's either very good or very bad, right? It means you either explained everything or it's so opaque that no one knows what to ask.
To what extent are various forms of religious phobia linked to the rise of religious nationalism? You think of Islamophobia within Myanmar, the kind of phobias present the other as an object of fear, as a threat.
Yes.
And certainly Islam and things like the 969 movement, the Buddhist movement, portrays Islam as subversive, as intolerant, as its objective is to dominate control. So that conception of the other as threat. Some forms of religious bigotry don't really do that. Like I think the way indigenous traditions are treated within Western cultures, there's bigotry, there's discrimination, but they're not seen as threat in that way. There's condescensions, there's patronizing attitudes, there's a whole layer of discriminatory attitudes, but it's not phobic in that sense of fear of the other. And I think it seems to be deeply, you think of anti-Semitism in the Nazi regime, the Jewish population, where Judaism was seen as a threat that would undermine German civilization, and so is phobia. Do we need to fine-tune phobia and think of it in terms of nationalism and religious forms of nationalism?
Right. I think what you said makes perfect sense. I would only want to add, though, that to that the analysis that even the kind of disparaging bigotry, it's not as obviously rooted in fear, right? It's not expressed in terms of a threat. But why is it expressed at all, right? There is a sense that something does not belong, right? That something should not be there, that other people should not take interest in it. Negative rhetoric against Hinduism escalated in the United States after Swami Vivekananda came and was a big hit. There were churches that felt very threatened by his message. There would be people flocking to hear him, mostly in Unitarian churches, but there would be more conservative pastors outside protesting. We should not allow this heathen to speak in the church. And so I think there is a fear at the root of it, but it's not as obvious, it's not as blatant, that there is some sense that there's something very compelling about these traditions that people who feel invested in the dominant tradition feel threatened by. So the first line of defense, you could say, is to demean it, disparage it, dismiss it. And then when that doesn't happen, then you get the deeper threats. You get the kinds of things, the more overt fear that you're talking about. I would argue that there's still fear embedded at the heart of any form of prejudice. That's my sense, anyway.
Thanks for a really helpful talk. Yesterday evening spent a bunch of time thinking about how to prize apart racism and religious phobia, because they so often travel together. And my first thought, as somebody who's new to this domain, as a scholar anyway, was that they always travel together. And I thought, no, that's not quite right. And then you gave an example. You said, well, in South Asia, it's going to be religious phobia without the same kind of racism as it occurs within North America, say. That's right. And of course, we all know that any kind of hatred is best understood intersectionally. And so I don't want to suggest that there's ever just a pure religious phobia that doesn't have other intersectional, axes. But I find myself wondering whether, the but means I'm about to undercut what I just said, but I'm wondering how close the relationship is between racist religious phobia and religious phobia that isn't colored in the same way by racism. I'd be grateful for your thoughts.
Oh, sure. And it may be a purely academic distinction, but in terms at least of the expression of the two, one can make a distinction, because what I've been calling the racist religious phobia, really, they don't really care what your religion is. They don't like you, right? Because the way you look or the way you talk or where you come from. Whereas with the specific, I would say the religious phobia is more specific. We don't like Hinduism because they have lots of gods, and they have weird chanting, and they have, and you even hear, like even the way the word guru is pronounced sometimes, they say guru like it's something silly, something derisive. Whereas it's something that we respect a great deal. Your guru is a very important person in your life. So the sort of very derisive, dismissive kind of prejudice directed against specific beliefs and practices is what I'm calling religious in nature. And I guess I would call that Hinduphobia proper. And then you have this wider racism that can afflict Hindus, it can afflict Sikhs, it can afflict Muslims, and it has even afflicted Indian Christians. Indian Christians have been attacked because of the way they look and talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would now like to invite Professor Ashok Vohra to address us. Professor Vohra comes to us from India. And in India, he is the go-to man on Wittgenstein. His book, Wittgenstein's Philosophy of the Mind, has recently been reissued. And what is more, he has translated Wittgenstein's philosophy, actually not philosophy, but his actual tract, into Hindi. It's such a remarkable achievement that people sometimes come to just see him, to pay visual tribute to him that he has undertaken this feat, performed this feat. Yeah. And Professor Vohra also is recently editing 5 volumes on the work and thought of one of India's premier modern thinkers, Professor Satchidanand Murthy. So please welcome Professor Vohra, and I invite him now to address us.
Is there no light here? At the outset, I must thank Professor Arvind Sharma. Oh, here. Okay. At the outset, I must express my thanks and gratefulness to Professor Arvind Sharma, Amanda, Patricia, for making me come here and make this presentation before you. Not only that, I had the opportunity they provided me the opportunity of listening to very, very profound papers yesterday and even today. They all open up a different perspective for me. So I'm really grateful to you, sir, for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity. I have really worked out a full paper, and I might be presenting, or some people might see it as my presentation of a counter view. Because though many of you are saying that there is no Hinduphobia, for example, just now, but I think there is Hinduphobia as much as there is Islamophobia, and there are other phobias. So what I have done in this short paper is that I have divided it into 3 parts. In the first part, I have tried, like a philosophy, because I am a philosophy student, so there is more of a conceptual clarification that I sought. So I begin with a conceptual clarification about the notion of phobia itself. And then I try to see how Hindutva has its own kind of phobia. And then I come to Hindutva and I say that Hindutva is nothing else but the worst example of a phobia in a country, in a multicultural country like ours. So, Theophobia is religiophobia for me. I'm using the 2 terms synonymously. Theophobia is an obsessive-compulsive psychological disorder in a person who normally feels comfortable in his own religion and believes religious practices, rituals, teachings, and places of worship, but fears those of other religions. That is to say, a person who is very comfortable in his own religion, but he fears the religion of others. So he is fully aware of the categories, the requirements, the understandings of his own religion. He lives it, but when it comes to the other's religion, other's form of life, then apparently he feels very uncomfortable with the notion of the other. Like xenophobia, it is irrational, intensive, and obsessive. Theophobia is marked by inexplicable anxiety or fear of the real or the imagined other, his religion, scriptures, God, and deities. Even atheists and agnostics may suffer from theophobia if they feel uncomfortable or fearful of a congregation or a place of worship, irrespective of the religion it is affiliated with. Theophobia can be a condition of an individual or even a community. So it is not that only an individual suffers from theophobia or religiophobia, but even a community as a whole can suffer from theophobia, and that will be more dangerous. A theophobia-ridden person or community's obsession with religion, religious or cultural otherness results in a radical change in their behavior, lifestyle, and attitude towards those who do not subscribe to their misplaced or maybe well-placed opinion. This attitude arouses in its followers a feeling of superiority towards their own religion and extreme dislike, bordering on hatred towards those belonging to other religions or even sects within their own religion. It disturbs the prevailing harmony among different religions and gives rise to an atmosphere of discrimination, divisiveness, extreme anxiety, and fear. It generates in the society a feeling of I and you, mine and yours, us and they. This usage of mine and yours arouses a sense of difference and diffidence, even a sense of superiority and inferiority. For what is mine is much dearer to me than what is yours. I see non-existent qualities in what is mine and am blind to the defects and shortcomings of its shortcomings. Likewise, I'm more likely to see non-existent defects in what is yours or others' religion and turn a blind eye to what is good in it. This natural psychological commitment to and love for that which is one's own, and natural psychological disdain for all that which belongs to you or other is therefore the root cause, though not the only cause, of division in society. It is an enemy of unity, harmony, and oneness in the social and religious fabric of any civilized society. As opposed to other aspects of life, in the case of religious beliefs, it is natural for one to be biased towards the doctrines and practices of the religion one is born in. It becomes the religion I am born in almost becomes an integral part of the form of one's life. It is like the skin, or like my skin or the DNA one is born with. Besides, as Arvind Sharma says, because of the principle of adherence to just and only one of the several religions, either by birth or by choice, is implicit in the conception of religion. In other words, it is not possible to be a follower of the religions of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam at the same time. At the same time, is very empathetic, because at one point of time in my life, I can only adhere to one religion. This sense of exclusive belonging or adherence to a single faith is a very important definitional marker of the notion of religion, so much so that it is not just the cause of inter-religious but also intra-religious conflicts. In Hinduism, these intra-religious conflicts are manifested in the form of the quarrel or the fights or bloody battles between Shaivites and Vaishnavites, between the Shaivas and the Shaktas. In Jainism, between Digambars and the Shvetambars. In Buddhism, between the Hinayanis and the Mahayanis, and so on. In Christianity, between the Protestants and Catholics. In Islam, between Shias and Sunnis. In Judaism, between Orthodox and conservative Judaism on one hand, and Reform and Reformationist Judaism on the other. These divisions are to be found not only in the ancient world religions, but also in the relatively newly founded religious sects. In the world's youngest religion, Sikhism, about which you talked just now, there are, besides the three major sects, which Khalsa, Namdhari, and Nirankari, there are Radha Swamis, Neeldharis, Nirmals, Ravidasis, Udasis, Nihangs, and several other subsects. There are several instances of skirmishes among them. In fact, one cannot tolerate the other. The psychological necessity of exclusive adherence to one's religion or one of the denominational leads to sentiments of unquestioned supremacy of one's religion, which in turn generates a sense of superiority in what is mine and a feeling of inferiority towards what is not mine. The superiority complex so generated results in not only inter-religious but also intra-religious strife. It is difficult, if not impossible, to escape the sense of psychological superiority and take pride in what are one's ideas, doctrines, faith, and argument, and find fault with and reject those that belong to others. This is in distinct contrast to our approach to the material goods and possessions. In the case of worldly possessions, one may envy others who have them and wish and struggle to acquire them, or even he be very keen on adopting their values and lifestyles. In case of if you have a very nice coat, I would like to buy. I like to have it. And likewise, and your values. If you are very rich, I may like to imbibe them. So, in the case of material goods, this happens. But in the case of religious beliefs, or in the case of spirituality, one wishes to maintain exclusivity and pity those who do not share his faith. I pity those who are non-Hindus. A Christian may pity me because I am not a Christian, and so on and so forth. Pity those who do not share his faith and religion. One may even go to the extent of converting others by persuasion, coercion, or otherwise to his faith. Thus starts a pull and push between the followers of various religions and their sects and subsects. That religiophobia is a natural condition of human beings can be best illustrated by taking the example of such an enlightened person as Mahatma Gandhi, the exemplar of religious tolerance and promoter of harmony among world religions. He preached that a deep understanding of his religion, as well as that of others, makes him realize that religions are different roads converging to the same point. What does it matter that we take different roads, so long as we reach the same goal? He, after critical and exhaustive study of deep reflection, concluded that all religions are true, and all religions have some error in them. But in his own lived life, he too was not able to escape the emotional tendency of regarding the religion practiced by him as superior to others. Talking about Hinduism, Gandhi said, "Hinduism to me is the most glorious religion in the world." He goes on to say, Hinduism I certainly prize above all other religions. Talking about his preference for the Hindu religion and its scriptures over other religions, he says, "I am unable to satisfy myself with Orthodox Christianity. Hinduism, as I know, it entirely satisfies my soul and fills my whole being, and I find solace in Bhagavad Gita and Upanishads that I miss even in the Sermon on the Mount." About religion one is born in or practices one has adhered to since the birth, he asks, "If I tell you to give up your religion, will you do so?" And answers it by saying, "Never." So these are the quotations that I have taken from Gandhi. They are over his whole life period. They are not given in one place, but all over his life, time and again, he was returning to this position. This shows that even Gandhi, who thought that all faiths constitute a revelation of truth, but all are imperfect and liable to error, could not escape the psychological necessity and the natural psychological feeling of exclusivism and superiority for what he considers as one's own or mine, as opposed to what belongs to the other. This inevitable psychological compulsion makes even such an enlightened and noble soul like him to admit, and I am quoting, "I hold my own religion." And then again he says sometimes later, "I hold my religion dearer than my country and that therefore I am a Hindu first and a nationalist after. This pride in his religion was to remain with him throughout his life. He time and again asserted, I have been born a Hindu and I shall die a Hindu, a Sanatanist Hindu. If there is salvation for me, it must be as a Hindu. Hinduism as a Hindu. Hinduism absorbs the best in other religions, and there is scope for expansion in it. From this, it naturally follows that Gandhi regarded Hinduism, the religion he was born in, as superior to other religions because, in his opinion, it accumulates the best in every religion and abandons all that is sullied. And what is sullied? What is sullied is in other religions. So the same thing can be said by the other religion, the people who are born with other religions, about Hinduism. Even in the matter of prayer, the liberal Gandhi said, my Hinduism tells me that along with the Hindu prayer, I should also offer the Muslim prayers and Parsi and Christian prayers. True Hinduism lies in offering prayers of all religions because only he is a good Hindu who is also a good Muslim and a good Parsi. However, he upholds that nothing elates me so much as the music of the Gita or the Ramayana of Tulsidas, the only two books of Hinduism I may be said to know. I know the vice that is going on today in the great Hindu shrines, but I love them. Even though they're sullied, but he loves them. But I love them in spite of their unspeakable failings. So even Gandhi considers it natural for one to take pride and consider his religion in which he was born or which he is voluntarily adopted to be superior to others and find its rituals, its teachings, its scriptures, its prophets, its founders much more profound and satisfying than all the others. One's religion and the rite and practices are likely to give one more solace than those of other religions. So much so that the practitioner of a religion in Gandhi's words admits no religion higher than his, and the day he would think so, he would change his religion. If he finds that other religions are higher than his religion, then he would change his religion. Gandhi himself traces the reason for this attachment with the religion in which one is born when he compares this attachment with an involvement in one's religion with the love and care of his wife. He says, I can no more describe my feelings for Hinduism than for my own wife. She moves me as no other woman in the world can. Not that she has no faults, I dare say she has many more than I see myself. But the feeling of an indissoluble bond is there. Even so, I feel for and about Hinduism with all its faults and limitations. This indissoluble bond between oneself and his religion is the cause of deep love for one's religion. As the Christian hymn says, love so amazing, so divine, this demands my soul, my life, my all. This excessive, maddening, and possessive love is the cause of one's taking pride in and considering one's religion as superior to other religions and an exclusive repository of absolute truth and faith. Just as Gandhi swears by his religion, I'm now giving a counter to what Gandhi said. Just as Gandhi swears by his religion and is ready to die for it, so are those who belong to other religions. Gandhi, over and above, again justifies his actions by saying, and he says, my religion teaches me. So are those belonging to other religions justified in taking refuge for their actions under the dictates of their religion. Like Gandhi, they may also invoke religious sanctions for justification of their deeds or even misdeeds. As long as the followers of different religions are confined, like a Robinson Crusoe on the island or like a frog in the well, to their religion and the practice dictated by it, and remain within their personal, private, and individual lives, there may not be any conflict. Nevertheless, the moment one enters into the social arena, public life, or public space, one is bound to compare and contrast it with other religions, for the dictates of a religion are to be carried out by a group or a society that has entered into its folds voluntarily or otherwise. Though many scholars, now I'm coming to the second part of my paper, though many scholars and reformers use the Rigvedic hymn, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, that is, the truth is one, the learned scholars interpret it differently and argue that Hinduism is a pluralistic, inclusive, and tolerant of other religions. However, the history of Hinduism, which of course is both ancient and Sanatan, that is eternal, believes this interpretation in theory and practice. Patanjali, in the 2nd century, as early as 2nd century BC, categorically asserts that the Shramanas, that is to say the separate branch from the Brahminism or Vedic religion, they are Jainas and Buddhas. The Buddhists and the Jainis and Brahmanas are eternal enemies, and the Brahmanas, Buddhists, Jainis, and on one hand, and Brahmanas on the other hand, are eternal enemies, like the snake and the mongoose. In the earlier medieval period, Kumaril Bhatta, early 17th century, pronounced that Shramanas, that is to say Buddhists and Jainas, as the ungrateful and alienated children who refuse to acknowledge what they owe to their parents, because they thought that Buddhism and Jainism, and that is a fact also, historical fact, that Buddhism and Jainism were an offshoot or they grew out of Hinduism. Shankar is even more rigid and uncompromising. He accuses the Buddha of incoherent patterns, or even deliberately and hatefully leading mankind into confusion. Madhusudan Saraswati, another Vedantin, in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, upholds that the teachings of the materialist Buddha and others, mark the word materialist, of the materialist Buddha and others are like those of Malechhas. He does not consider them even worthy of his comments. Apan and Sambardar, down south in India, the two Nayanar Shaiva saints used denigrative phrases like shameless Jain monks, naked Jains who fast by night, wicked monks who eat in the barbaric ways, the weak and filthy Jains with their yellowing teeth, mad Jain monks who wear mats and pluck their hair and eat their food standing, etc. These are the practices in Jaina religion. The criticism of the Shramanic tradition seems to be unprovoked, to me at least. The only critical remarks of Brahminism that I came across are contained in the Dhammapada, 27th chapter, and the verse 396, where a Brahman, if he is not free from moral defilements, is called Bhovadi. The word bho is a familiar word of address in Pali language. It is used to address inferiors and equals. It is like you. instead of thou. You have to compare between thou and you. Is a familiar term of address in Pali language. It is used to address inferiors and equals. The Brahmins reproachfully call Buddha the Buddha Bhogotma, whereas Buddha should normally be addressed as Bhante. Buddha is the Bhante, that is the saint, the venerable. The hatred for this Brahmanic religion was not only to be found in the texts of Hinduism. It is not just that at a theoretical plane there was this kind of a hatred towards their own subsect. The hatred for the Shramanic religion was not only to be found in the texts of Hinduism, but this hatred was also put into practice. The Saurya Purana categorically asserts that the Charvakas, Buddhists, and Jainas should not be allowed to settle in a kingdom. The Buddhist work Divyadana records that Sunga was a great prosecutor of Buddhists who announced an honorarium of 100 panas or dinars for every Shramana head. Many other literary texts portray pejorative views of the life and teachings of Buddhists and Jainas. Kalhan's Rajtarangarin, a 12th century history text, is full of episodes relating to the persecution of the two Shramanic traditions. One such narrative is about Ashoka's son Juluka, who was a Shaivite and who destroyed every Buddhist monastery he came across. Shashank, a contemporary of Harshvardhan, cut down the Bodhi tree at Gaya, which is most venerable for the Buddhist tradition, destroyed 1,600 stupas and monasteries, and killed thousands of Buddhists and Buddhist monks and the laity, their followers. Historian Guye has reported that there was a fierce battle in the year 1299. I have come from the ancient to the medieval to now the modern period. In the year 1299, between the Shaivites, there was a fierce battle between the Shaivites and Vaishnavites in Haridwar. The Naga Sadhus won a decisive battle over the Bairagis, a Vaishnava sect. In the year 1760, again, the war took over. The Shaivas won a battle in the same place, the battle in which about 18,000 persons were killed. It is reportedly settled once and for all the supremacy of the Shaivites over the Vaishnavites, the later war. In Ayodhya, after the death of Aurangzeb, there was another battle between the Shaivas and Sannyasis and the Vaishnavas, Vairagis, in the year 1707. Many other narratives of plunder and destruction are indicative of Hinduism's hostility towards other religions. Their narratives meet the stringent requirements laid down by the historians and anthropologists and archaeologists to be called historical facts. They are all supported. It is generally argued that Hinduism is a very tolerant and inclusive religion because it assimilates into itself the teachings of other religions and their saints. They support their argument by taking the example of the Vaishnavization of Rishabdeva, that is Jaina, and Buddha, whom Hindus regarded as avatar. They tried to accommodate them as avatars, that is, incarnations of the Supreme Lord Vishnu. They said both Rishabdev as well as Buddha is an incarnation, is a 10th incarnation of Vishnu. As you know, in the mythology or in the history, whatever you may like to call it, there are 9 avatars of Vishnu so far. Now, they said that Buddha, to accommodate him into their fold, They said Buddha is the 10th avatar of Vishnu. To each of these arguments, Padamnath S. Jaini, a very big Jaina scholar, replies as follows. About Rishabdeva of Vishnu, he writes, Vaishnavization of Jainism, though through the device of avatar, is a fine example towards a syncretism of two rival faiths. About the avatar of Buddha as Vishnu, he observes that it was a way for opening of, and I'm quoting, opening or introducing Brahman priests to officiate at the Buddhist temples. So there was an ulterior motive behind this. However, both attempts failed as they were guided by nefarious intentions. Buddha and Jainas maintain their individual identities and assert their rights. One can conclude this session with the remark of Swami Vivekananda, in which, after condemning the excessive ritualism, indifference to human misery, sectarianism, and casteism, Vivekananda observes that no religion on earth practices the dignity of humanity in such lofty strains as Hinduism, and no religion on earth treads upon the necks of the poor and the low in such a fashion as Hinduism. So it is very good to quote Vivekananda's first part, but later part is also to go with it. In other words, the high of Hinduism, and that's my observation, the high of Hinduism is very high, and its low is really very low. The scholars like Arvind Sharma, who uphold that Hinduism is a tolerant and inclusive religion, and he argues ad infinitum, have to give convincing and historically factual and doctrinally correct account in support of their conviction. To conclusively establish their thesis, they have not to base them on selective theories and facts, but have to be comprehensive. They need to pay attention to what K. Sachidananda Murthy, whose books I am editing right now, Murthy's observation based on Jaimini and Kumaril, saying that the Vedic faith is exclusive. Both Kumaril and Jaimini have said this, and Hinduism is as exclusive as the Semitic faiths, and Brooks no rivals. They have to make it explicit that each statement such as all religions are true and made only on their authority. They have to clarify this, that it is on their authority and not on the authority of any shastra, any religious book, any scripture, that they have to say this. And do not represent the orthodox Hindu tradition. So we have to be careful about that. And now I come to the third part of my paper, the concluding part on Savarkar. Though the question about exclusivism of Hinduism may not be well settled, because they may just say that I'm only representing one side of the picture and they are representing another side of the picture. There is no doubt that Hindutva, which is claimed to be a variant of Hinduism, is exclusivist. It teaches that other religions and their followers are untrustworthy or even dangerous. The guiding maxim of Hindutva, according to Savarkar, is, and I'm quoting from him, that's to say, the principle on which Hindutva is based is one who wields the sword has the truth on his side. It is aimed not so much at spirituality as to reacquire territory, rehabilitate religion, preserve the Vedas and Shastras, protect cows and Brahmins, and establish suzerainty and diffusion of Hindu fame and glory. He argues that Hinduism is only a derivative, a fraction, a part of Hindutvas, and it embraces all the departments of thought and activity of the whole beings of our Hindu race. The purpose of Hindutva ideology or movement is to establish a Hindu nation or Hindu Rashtra or Hindu state in which there is a clear distinction in which the notion of I and the other is promoted. In such a state, the boundaries between the categories of us and them, friends and foes, Hindus and Muslims, Hindus and non-Hindus, righteous and wicked, tormentors and the tormented, victors and the vanquished, oppressors and the oppressed, retribution and rewards are clearly and distinctly drawn. The borderline is absolutely clear. There is no confusion and no ambiguity in their connotation and denotation. One can say that Hindutva represents a political aspect of Hinduism. I can give that concession to them. It for political purposes highlights social and cultural distinctions between one person or group and other persons and groups. The factions that make Hindutva exclusive are a common nation, that is Rashtra, a common race, that is Jati or class, and a common civilization, that is Sanskriti. Hindutva doctrine completely ignores the spiritualistic and social aspects of Hinduism, and still it calls itself more comprehensive than Hinduism. That is a tragedy. Shashi Tharoor, another Indian politician and a writer and an intellectual, has rightly pointed out in his book, Why I Am a Hindu, that Hinduism has always acknowledged the existence of opposites, and I think this is a true position. Hinduism has always acknowledged the existence of opposites and reconciled them to. Pain and pleasure, success and failure, creation and destruction, life and death are all manifestations of duality inherent in human existence. These pairings are not contradictory but complementary. They are aspects of the same overriding reality. So also with the secular and the sacred. A Hindu's life must involve both to acknowledge this. This would both absorb to acknowledge that which will absorb both defects and absorb and deflect the unsavory aspects of the resurgence of Hindutva. More importantly, Hinduism in the contemporary times agglomerates pluralistic, vast, and open-ended, while Hindutva is monistic, narrow, and close-ended. Hinduism is always evolving. It always tries to accommodate things. Arvind Sharma, making a distinction between the Shishta, Arvind Sharma tries to accommodate them by making a distinction between Shishta and Loka, that is to say, the cultured or the educated view and the common man's view, common man's view of Hindutva. Whereas Shishta view, that is the educated, reflective view of Hindutva, may advocate the exclusivistic doctrine of Hindutva, while the majoritarian view, the majoritarian part of the Hindu community represents a Loka view, the common man's view, would invariably and firmly swear by the theories, teachings, and practices of inclusivist and tolerant Hinduism. Since Hindutva is close-ended and leaves no scope for evolution, and innovation, and most of the practicing Hindus do not endorse the doctrine of Hindutva, and they are happy with the Sanatana Dharma's inclusivism and pluralism. They regard Hindutva as an extreme case of theophobia. Let me conclude, friends. I hope I have time. Just 2 minutes. 2 minutes, yeah. Let me conclude with a popular prayer, or ardas, as it is called, sung by the Sikhs. It without any phobia of superiority or inferiority, wishes the welfare of all sections of the society without any discrimination of class, caste, or profession. It summarizes the central teachings of Guru Bani. And I have translated this. This is my translation of that. So maybe it suffers from some errors. But I hope all of you being so enlightened beings, you will forget my bad translation, if at all. And if I'm not able to communicate, maybe one can go back to the original Urdas, which is in Punjabi. O Guru Nanak, the true emperor, bestow on us the boon of pure love and mutual understanding, of livelihood, sustenance and daily bread, of true and selfless love, of pure and clean water, and of the blessings of the Guru's Bani. The eternal word, thou give justice to the givers of our daily bread. We surrender our minds and honor to you. Pray thou, save us all, pardon us all, save us all, forgive us all. May laborers get wages worthy of their labor. May thou bestow on us the virtue of patience and perseverance. May thou fulfill all our benign wishes and endow us with milch cows and buffaloes, with milks and sacrificed and clarified butter, and the merit of Japuji recitation, that is the recitation of the smaller version of Guru Bani, with folded hands do we pray unto thee, save us all, pardon us all, save us all, forgive us all. We, the earthlings of Kali Yuga, the dark age, are brimming with egoism and afflicted with the vices of bad-mouthing, backbiting, and calumny. O Lord, thou hast saved countless of souls. Save this mortal too. Save the mortal too, this mortal too. Save the whole world, O Lord. So it is a prayer for the whole of the world. This ardas, to my mind, sums up the true spirit of Hinduism. And it has got nothing to do with what is called Hindutva. Thank you very much for listening to me so patiently.
Thank you, Professor Vohra. In the interest of staying within the limits of the time allotted to us, I propose that we hear the next speaker, and then have questions together on the two presentations at the end. Thank you all. I now invite Professor Patrice Brodeur to address us. He is the Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Montreal. His focus is on contemporary Islam and interreligious dialogue, and his research themes I have to read out because they are very detailed. 1, intervisional dialogue and conflict resolution. 2, pluralistic management of sacred space. And 3, intervisional pedagogy. I give you Professor Brodeur.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor Sharma, for your introduction. It's an honor to be here and to have you as the president for our panel. Thank you, and it's a joy to be sharing this panel with great scholars of Hinduism, of which I am not, obviously, as you've now learned. And so that's thanks to the flexibility of the organizer, Professor Kirkpatrick. There we go. And I thank you profoundly for making this switch for me to be able to still participate participate in this symposium at the end of it. So I made an effort to broaden a little bit sort of my set of usual sort of concerns with Abrahamic religious traditions and have a few instances where I dabble into Hinduism and Hinduphobia as well. And so I hope to take a bit of a comparative religion approach in which I was trained anyway as a historian of religion, of mostly Abrahamic religious traditions, but also of other traditions, including learning, of course, on Buddhism and Hinduism, even taking a whole course on Jainism way back then. So there we go. So on that note, I just want to say that it's hard, where can I start? And what can I meaningfully say when my contribution falls on the last panel, the last speaker of the last panel of a two-day symposium? And how can I avoid repeating what others have already said, especially if, sadly, and I apologize, I was not even there to hear them because I was, until yesterday evening, in Nigeria. And so I was somewhere between Abuja and Kaduna, to be more specific, in central Nigeria. I therefore apologize in advance for this specific context of my arrival among you as goes the French expression, un cheveu sur la soupe, a hair on top of the soup. Undoubtedly, so far, I'm sure that various analytical approaches have been used to address our more than timely focus on religious phobia, such as lexicology, to deconstruct the origins and meanings of our key terms, concepts, and cognate ones, with, of course, suggestions as to what alternative terminology might be better or simply complementary in meaning. That's the first, lexicology. The second, of course, approach, I'm sure, has already popped up in terms of history, whether used for recent, older, or ancient past instances, or a third approach, political science, to examine how discourses of otherness, of otherization, that include in part a complex mixture of ignorance, of intolerance, of stereotype, of prejudice, of scapegoating, to use Girard's very important sort of study on that for decades, that can too easily contribute to discrimination with or without direct hate crimes, whether done individually or collectively, all of which reflect power dynamics that emerge at the intersections of a confluence of real, embodied, and imagined representations that serve as the lubricant of meaning in a cobweb of structural and systemic realities of discrimination. Our common humanity, especially in its semiotic and hermeneutical dimensions, which is a bit more of the focus I bring, is permeated by identity and power dynamics that are worth deconstructing briefly because they are the source, in my opinion, of what might make us understand better why we are here today discussing what is a perennial challenge with new layers of complexity, including the exponential growth of our problem given the exponential growth of the world's population. So the sheer number of people that are victims of these kinds of intolerances has obviously grown exponentially and is bound, unfortunately, to increase most likely. I propose to combine to the above disciplinary triad of semiotics and hermeneutics, or in the shape of lexicology, history, and political science, a second triad composed of its own three elements or disciplinary approaches of social psychology, conflict transformation, and spirituality. Our linguistic heritage is sometimes so heavy that changing a word or its dominant meaning is almost impossible. I shall give three examples, more or less from a chronological perspective of when those terms emerged. My first example is related to the word anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism remains the preferred option over, for example, Judeophobia, despite calls by many non-Jews, especially those who share a linguistic, ethnic, or cultural identity linked to a Semitic language other than Hebrew. The often heard argument goes this way: how can I be anti-Semitic if I'm also part of the broad Semitic family? This argument I have heard in particular amongst many Arabic communities, whether Muslim or Christian, in religious identity, not to mention the challenge faced by the few Jews, but they do exist, who have positively associated themselves to being Arabic-speaking Jews, and therefore, in some ways, Arab Jews, as I've heard sometimes being used. Even the title of a famous book by Shuraki, nobody else but somebody who became, of course, head of the city of Jerusalem for some time. So, so this situation raises two correlated questions. Where does the resistance to changing the word anti-Semitism to, let's say, for example, Judeophobia come from? Is it only because there is a misreception, and I'm playing on the difference between misperception and misreception, amongst the majority of Jews to hear the above expression among so many other Semites? And here, of course, I don't have time to go into the reasons of why Jews have been associated to Semite, which is in and of itself a modernist construct coming out of a particular form of racist understanding of races, Semite being a kind of race, a category of race. Or is it the reverse, a misreception of Jewish current understandings among non-Jewish so-called Semites? So those are two interrelated questions that I'm asking myself. The second example is that of Islamophobia. I am not sure whether it is best to use this neologism instead of its close alternative, Islamomysia, unrecognizable by most, in part because its originally Greek suffix mysia, meaning hatred, is hardly used in the English-speaking world, unlike the suffix phobia, widely used in such words as xenophobia, arachnophobia, etc., etc. More importantly, it is the complete alternative expression put forward by many, that is, anti-Muslim racism, which dominates today amongst many persons directly fated as Muslims, or sometimes even those misperceived as such because of stereotypes in dress, or names, or general phenotypes. Sikhs, non-Muslims with Arabic names, or derivatives, etc. And here, by far, especially in majority culturally Christian countries, the association of the hijab especially, but also chadar, niqab, or burqa, not to mention other forms of dress, that Muslim women bear the brunt, so the Muslim women bear the brunt of the hate, the fear, the racism, etc. Thus, the important need for the concept of gendered Islamophobia, as powerfully articulated by Dr. Monia Mazir in her recent book published this year in Toronto, entitled Gendered Islamophobia. And here you have to see, I have the book, by the way, if you want to see it later, because it says, my journey with a scar, parentheses, F, parentheses. So, with a scarf, okay? This unique gender dimension raises a particularity to the contemporary widespread phenomenon of Islamophobia that has become transnational, lest we forget the only too real local reality of the perfect example here in Quebec of Bill 21, La Loi 21. My third example, and now I'm venturing on your territory, of Hinduphobia, an even more recent neologism, or, as I've just learned from an earlier presentation, a subspecies of Hinduphobia. As I am sure was already mentioned, the history of the term Hindu is itself the result of an intricate history of identity and power dynamics, combining both medieval encounters by the nascent Arabo-Muslim community, expanding its political reach up to first the river at the heart of today's Pakistan, which we call the Hindu River or the Indus River, thus the name Indus Valley Civilization that has been popularized. But interestingly enough, the Arabic is al-Hind, Hind, but that itself is a distortion of Sindhu, the Sanskrit for river. But then was the concept of river the name of the river itself? Now I'm turning to the historians of that period from a Hindu perspective, or what we now call a Hindu perspective. I don't know the answer to that question. So if in the Q&A this could be clarified, I would appreciate. But definitely, ultimately, the fact that we say Hindustan in Persian and Hindustani and all of this comes from al-Hind, from the Arabic way of distorting the word Sindhu for river, for that particular river in what is today called Pakistan. And so you see the intricate dynamic of eventually the Muslims taking power gradually from that specific regions to the broader northern, of what we call northern India today, And India, of course, in and of itself, being sort of all the way sort of, back through, the Christopher Columbus discovery of India and so on and so forth. So you can see how there's a fascinating inter-civilizational dynamic in the emergence of certain key words who become dominant because of power dynamics of certain languages being linked to particular political powers of civilizations and empires and so on and so forth. Okay, I'll leave it at that. So, but then linked to this, eventually, you have also sort of the later sort of development of Hinduism, which of course has been popular by late 19th century British Orientalists. And they're trying to make sense of that diversity of strands of schools of thought that they like to pull together into this concept of Hinduism versus other religious traditions in existence in the subcontinent at that point, i.e. Islam, Buddhism, although very little, in fact, at that point in time. And even Jainism was included in Hinduism, according to the British Orientalists at that time, in the late 19th, all the way up to between the two world wars, more or less, when eventually, I guess after reactions from Jains, and the earlier quotes and references, I think, indicate why, Jains eventually were able to finally convince British Orientalists that they should be considered a different religion. A concept in and of itself also foreign to that subcontinent history. So, if you think about those three examples, you end up with what I call historical development that led to what Haig in 2017 calls generalized domestication. That is, certain terms come to be generally accepted by the normative expression as the common concepts to use. And so this is also the case for Islamophobia in Canadian politics more recently, or anti-Semitism to this day within sort of the broad sort of diversity of Jewish worldviews within the dynamic of Jewish communities worldwide. And so you have the domestication of particular words that become normative as a reference point, whether or not they make sense today, given the historical knowledge and deconstruction that we, the scholars, analytical traditions do. So we're constantly sort of playing with that dynamic as well as scholars, I would believe. The process by which such domestication takes place is complex. It combines power and identity dynamics, as I said, that thrive at the complex and constantly moving intersections of numerous spectra of opposing alternatives. And this comes from my sort of breaking down sort of different elements of our human dynamics into spectra with opposite binary concepts. For example, is it centralized decision-making or decentralized decision-making? Is it highly educated elites in the population or less educated? However we define the word education, of course, that's another story, and so on and so forth. So by taking a variety of different binary sort of concepts, and seeing the intersection between all of those varying constantly in how identities function, i.e., especially now that the concept of intersectionality has been sort of popularized, and rightly so, in our understanding and deconstructing of those power dynamics relating to particular kinds of oppressed identities, marginalized identities, and so on and so forth. I believe that it's very important to use that information to rethink in many ways the way in which we do our critical historical readings. And so ultimately the combination of all of these different intersections marks the unique persons we each are, living within a unique set of identity communities, always, and that's the additional point, which I don't think intersectionality quite does it, or at least to my knowledge, always in constant interrelations with other human beings. In other words, the identity itself is a product of interrelatedness. It's never only something that one individual ends up developing on their own. They're developing it in dynamic of either X or in, meaning by opposition or by attraction to other dynamics in their midst. So what marks a modern development of what scholars of religiously might simply call today modern religious intolerance discrimination? That's to add to the pre-modern layer of religious phobia, to put it in simple terms. There's a more recent sort of layer of modern developments in that development is due to the nature of political power as structures of nation states have emerged in the last 2 centuries or so, with an ever greater systematization of their respective powers to control the population within increasingly tight borders. That is unique to the modern period, but also overlapping with the dominant positivistic reading of the way in which nationalisms emerged. So there's a combination of two things here in the modern sort of nation-state structures, with the combination of a particular dominant, I would argue, positivistic epistemology of understanding of the nation-state and the ideology of nationalism, based mostly on, initially at least, on ethno-nationalism, of a dominant nation, ethnicity within a particular geographical space. This has resulted in what is often referred to as state-sponsored efforts at controlling an increasing number of aspects in human life, including when a group of persons is perceived as a threat for one reason or another. The colonial heritage of today's nation-states worldwide is marked by two dimensions in particular. The structures of political power, as I mentioned, are put in place to serve and or control its population, which is based on the notion of who belongs or not in that territory, often understood positivistically, that is, as a continuous physical space to be managed and protected by a single source of control, whether through more democratic or more authoritarian processes and structures of decision-making and surveillance. The question is, why couldn't there be two capitals on the same territory, for example? It's because the implicit understanding, and that's impossible because with one territory comes one possible capital. And that construct is based in a positivistic understanding of how one should control a particular territory. And so if you notice how maps are drawn, these lines are mutually dividing territories, right? The map of the world with the boundaries of the nation states. But if you now take the there's a brilliant website that actually sort of maps the diversity of territories of indigenous communities throughout the Americas. I don't know if you've ever seen that website. You have to go and see it. Because these territories everywhere overlap to different degrees. So there isn't a notion of mutually exclusive space as some space belonging only to one group. There are shared overlapping spaces. You see a different understanding that is definitely not, of course, positivistic. So, sorry, I lost my space there. Okay. So, I am not sure whether it is best to use the setting, so the second, no, sorry, okay, so basically what we find ourselves sort of as a result today is that the source of a lot of intolerance, part of the additional religious intolerance, has taken the form of what has been called fundamentalism, religious fundamentalisms, right? And of course, the beautiful fundamentalism project coming out of the University of Chicago, especially the results in the 5-book series that was published in the 1990s, has done this incredible comparative analysis of how this phenomena of modernizing religions have somehow come together, at least in some currents of all of the major religious traditions, to overlap with political ideologies in a very particular way. That is also a more recent development too. So it's that I would call it a 20th century layer on top of the religious layers of before, okay? And so we get a new sense of what political religion, therefore, means in general through the examination and comparison of the specific examples that have emerged over the last decades, whether it is in the form of political Christianity, and this is not just in our neighbors in the United States, but the Christian right, so-called, but also in some form, in some currents of conservative ideology of Canadian politics also. But there's distinctions there, of course, that need to be made, and it's not to the same degree as to the South. Or political Judaism, the notion of Zionism itself being both Jewish, but with a very old history of also Christian Zionism, which in fact predates, sorry for what might sound paradoxical, but Jewish Zionism, coming out of the late 19th century in Basel, the first Basel conference on Zionism. The Christian Zionists, among especially Anglicans, go back way before. And so there's an interesting sort of dynamic of interrelatedness in this case, again, which is rarely understood as shaping each other's developments within different communities. Or, of course, political Islam, or what is more recently sort of coined as Islamism. And so those dynamics are very important, but of course, political Hinduism and the whole question of Hindutva. And it was fascinating to listen to your presentation because you confirmed what, in much more precise ways with good examples. Sometimes Hindutva is a subset of Hinduism, and now some Hindutva ideologies or scholars are trying to make the reverse, that Hindutva is broader than Hinduism. So then the political nature of interpreters key terms in our religious communities, linked, of course, to particular political realities within the Indian context of the BJP being in power today. But again, that is a development that in and of itself mirrors political Islam and Jewish Islam, in Jewish Zionism and Christian Zionism and Christian political developments and so on and so forth. And lo and behold, we're not including Buddhophobia in this conference, in this symposium, but I believe that it's only a question of time before it emerges because of the developments in Myanmar with the military coup and the xenophobia, the Islamophobia that led to some even go as far as calling it the genocide of the Rohingya people in parts of, or province in particular of Myanmar. And also the developments in the southern part of, in Thailand, where you're beginning to see more and more sort of the coming together of the dominant ideology of nationalism being linked to a particular, Buddhism, to which, of course, the minority Muslims in the south are reacting to. And so thus sort of the development, of course, of a tighter sort of Islamic perspective on Buddhism being problematic and to be rejected and so on and so forth, in part as a reaction to political exclusion as minorities in the South. So again, interrelated dynamics taking place. So, and of course, we can talk about political Sikhism and the desire to have the emergence of a Khalistan for independent of India. And again, you see sort of the similar sort of dynamics, and I'm not including Kashmir and other parts and other regions, China and the Uyghur, for example, etc. As long as these religious ideologies are done from a positivist epistemology, they reflect, in fact, a rising tide in many countries around the world of ethno-nationalist discourses with various forms of exclusions, whether xenophobic, racist, and by racist in this case, I mean specifically skin color based, ethnic, linguistic, religious, etc. The identity targets of otherization processes are numerous, multi-directional, and an intersectional approach can help dissect the victims of these manifold forms of intolerance and discrimination, whether rooted in religious, secular, or other forms of worldviews. But that is not enough. An interworldview approach that studies carefully the intersections between identity and power dynamics is essential to increase our understanding of what has been happening possibly throughout human history. It's a bold claim, but I'm throwing it out. But only on an exponential scale of real and potential traumas today. The current 3-week, as of today, Israel-Hamas war is a particularly poignant, catastrophic, and challenging case in point, where overlapping secular and religious, where both imperial and religious myoping and forgetting in the making of ethno-nationalist discourses, as well as religious politicizations based on otherwise century-old values, justice, for example, and a use of often too exclusivist memory that conveniently sets aside dimensions of history that are more complex of the interdependency between identity groups, depending, of course, on various spheres of history and locations. These problematic processes that create and sustain exclusivist, discriminatory, and often violent individual and collective behaviors, including more recently broader systemic nation-state policing, surveillance, and military interventions, as well as what is perceived by some as rogue terrorist and others as, and from a completely opposite perspective, as liberational, heroic, semi-independent polities become ever more embroiled to different degrees with religious discourses of intolerance and discrimination, depending on, of course, on the nature of polity or government, as well as which ideology may be in power at a given point in time. For example, we have the conservatives versus the liberal in Canada not having played the same role in the dynamics of fostering Islamophobia as a particular case in this country. But you have Akbar, and then you have Aurangzeb, two completely different kinds of political Muslim leadership over a majority of Hindus back 500 years more or less ago. So one needs to be aware of these very important distinctions. In one form or another, in ways that mirror each other, not in binary simplistic ways, but in kaleidoscopic mirroring game that no one person can fully grasp. I'm the first one not to understand that complexity. Humanity, or parts thereof, find itself in a potential perfect storm of misunderstandings, only increasing the many gaps between numerous identity groups, whether religious, ideological, ethnic, gender, linguistic, cultural, social class, etc., etc. So I'll skip because I have no more time. Is that correct? 2 minutes? 2 minutes. I might manage. So, within the now I'm giving a very concrete example. Within the OSCE, which brings together countries from 55 different countries, there is one branch called the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, or DEAR, based in Warsaw, that monitors a wide range of discriminatory behavior with data gathering from across its 50 nation-state members. It is a laudable longitudinal effort to measure the extent of discriminatory discourse, bias, and acts criminalizable that could be improved if more collaboration could be achieved with specific identity communities that have their own mechanisms for data gathering. For example, they don't work with the Anti-Defamation League or with the ISESCO, which has its own sort of observatory of Islamophobia, etc. The challenge, though, is often encountered when defining those key words, and that's what makes the collaboration so difficult, and what accounts, therefore, for discrimination. Should critique of Islam, actually critiques in any form of Islam, especially when it's linked to politics in the form of theocratic states, Iran, Afghanistan, automatically any of this critique can be considered to be Islamophobic or not? Should critique of the State of Israel in any form be automatically considered anti-Semitic? It's a parallel question. And of course, given your presentations before, the same applies to any critique of the current sort of Indian government, the BJP, vis-à-vis sort of whether or not it's Hinduphobia to be critiquing the government. So there are parallels. Such definitional challenges, so central to the work of academic research, can be epitomized at an even broader international level, knowing how the United Nations encountered a dead end several years ago when trying to reach a consensus on the definition of terrorism, facing deep opposition by some of its nation-state members as to whether it should include or not nation-state terrorism or sponsored terrorism as part of its definition. We didn't, a dead end. We couldn't go anywhere. In the aftermath of a lack of consensus, the rise of counter-violent extremism and the use even of the concept of radicalization also did not make any consensus, as of an article by Hedges in 2017, not to mention frustrating and aggravating and numerous cases where individuals and communities, religious and NGOs, for example, found themselves embroiled in surveillance out of suspicion for whose roots go back thousands of years when taking along history lenses of reproductive discourses of religious and more recently nationalist intolerance of one sort or another. More research, therefore, is needed, linking the already existing databases documenting social problems, i.e. discrimination, such as the example in Brodeur, to those that try to also document solutions, because so far it's been pretty negative what I talked about. But there are also people doing research on trying to gather database of positive things, of positive interreligious dialogue, for example. I've been part of doing that at KCID. And the methodology of trying to have the communication between those organizations to work at research, combining the two in the spectra from the negative to the positive, so that we don't focus only on reporting back on negatives, but also on positive. Because that, I think, is a more sort of honest sort of way of looking at the reality out there. It's not just negative. Is part of our task as scholars. This may help expand the means by which to address how to identify better when interpersonal and intergroup, as well as interstate and global cyber dynamics, reproduce and consolidate the drama triangle in order to find better ways to transform that drama triangle of the victim, victimizers, rescuer, into the empowerment triangle of the creator, the coach, and the challenger. This is, of course, coming out of social psychology and its use in spaces of conflict transformation. So, I know my time is up. So in the interval view dialogue approach which I've been developing, that emphasizes the global interdependence between identity and power dynamics, I define succinctly this interplay as stratified and hierarchized dynamics of contextual meaning and emotions, meaning being more intellectual, emotions, of course, being the limbic part of the brain, that either connects or distances us from each other. In conclusion, without emergent creativity, a concept developed by the Redicups at the University of St. Paul here, to address what I had referred already back in 2016 as religiophobia, not knowing that this eventually would be popularized, the chances are that unless there are significant investment in peace education and everything around that, the dominant momentum in international relations will remain one where power made up of brute physical and psychological violent force will continue to dominate those efforts among a minority of human beings, many of whom are here, that call for and work towards a nonviolent force that is inclusive of all human beings, equitable in the distribution of our economic riches, and finally, sustainable, both humanly and in our relationship to the natural environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Now, if we decide to go to the reception at 4:30 rather than 4:15, then we can have about 10 minutes for questions before we have the closing remarks. So if that is acceptable to us, let's have questions. There is the, you want to use this? There is a mic up there too. There is a lectern there.
That's better when it's sitting at the front for the camera.
All three?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's a good idea. Please. No, please.
Phobia of any kind is not acceptable. But we have to look at what is causing phobia in many of these religions. Now, I have examined Muslim. I believe that in their theology, they state that if you kill in the name of Allah, you go to heaven and you'll be rewarded with 7 virgins. To begin with, in the spiritual world, there is no sex. Now, there are a lot of intellectuals here who are Muslims. Can you please explain this?
If this works or not, but maybe...
It sounds... You try this one?
Or maybe this one. Okay, let's hope that this one works better. Thank you for your question. I am not a Muslim, first and foremost. I'm a Christian, so that's just for you to know. And whatever the beliefs are about the afterlife, and the images, the symbolic images that are used, then that will vary from Muslim to Muslim as to how much they will interpret it literally versus figuratively. And so I think that you need to understand that this is not for all Muslims understood literally. That's one point. And second, of course, these are precisely the kinds of differences between different understanding of what afterlife might entail between different religious traditions. And that's part of why we need dialogue, to at least clarify those differences as a first step, and then decide what to make of it personally. And if it means that you judge negatively that particular understanding of afterlife, it is your right to do so. At the same time, it is important to respect the fact that for some, they may end up interpreting it literally, although not all Muslims do. So I think that there's a variety there to recognize as well. So that's my initial sort of feedback, and I don't know if there's a Muslim in the midst that may want to give their understanding of it, because that would be important in this case.
I wonder if I could add something too?
Yes, please.
Not speaking only of Islam, but generally, I think it's virtually impossible to judge what an individual is going to actually believe and do based on a sort of textbook description, maybe, of their faith, right? So I've had this argument with people on social media. I say, so you identify as a Hindu? Yes. So you believe in the castes? You believe that some people are more pure than others? No, I don't believe that. But that's in your scripture. It's like, yeah, but that's not, that's not the Hinduism I practice, right? If you take, let's say, 3 Christians who are in a church, and part of the service is reciting the Nicene Creed. And let's say you interview 3 of them randomly after the service. Say, when you recited the creed, what did it mean to you? One person might give a fairly orthodox and well-informed understanding of Trinitarian and incarnational theology and explain it. Someone else is going to say something which they believe very deeply and sincerely, but which may not bear much resemblance to Orthodox theology at all. And someone else might say, I have no idea what it means, I'm there with my parents, I'm bored, I don't know. And they'll be all part of the same church, doing the same thing. So one thing that very much concerns me in terms of all the religious phobias is, just as Dr. Vohra said, and I will own this. We might cherry pick the portion of Hindu scriptures that we like and say, yes, it teaches this. But if we are not careful, we might pick those portions of other belief systems that are very negative and say, this is what you people believe. And it may be true of some people, but not of all. And the ideology that you were describing, I think, is of a very extreme sort of fairly modern, politicized iteration of the tradition, maybe based on older texts, but I wouldn't want to use it to judge all practitioners of Islam, or even most. So.
It's not a question of judgment. It's a question of what is fueling. Okay, what is causing these killings of people by Muslims? They believe that you kill, you go to heaven. If you do anything, look at Salman Rushdie. He is an intellectual. He wrote a book, Satanic Verses. He was in hiding for so many years. He came back and they almost killed him because they believe that if you say anything against Allah and you kill the person who has blasphemed, you're going to heaven, and you're going to get vengeance.
I think it's important that you actually read the declaration of on a common word that has emerged in Jordan initially with a group of scholars from all of the different branches of Islam that will actually completely challenge what you've just said about their Muslim understanding of Islam. There's also the Declaration of Amman, which rejects the kind of use of extremism in the name of Islam, which has been ratified by a variety of other declarations subsequently that are coming out, whether of Morocco, of Saudi Arabia, of Bahrain, of the Common Fraternity document of 2019, of February 2019, between Pope Francis and Sheikh Tayyib, on the common fraternity that all human beings share together, rejecting violence in the name of religion very clearly. And so there are now numerous declarations by all of the major leaders of the Islamic world that will reject what you're saying, in part because, in their opinion, from my summary of it, is that there's a feeling that some radical extremist Islamic, so-called Islamic organizations hijacked Islam. That's a concept that I've often heard used by Muslims. And so I think it's important for other people, non-Muslims in particular, to understand sort of those diverse and opposing views within the broad diversity of Muslim perspectives on these questions.
Yeah, okay. Any other question? Please.
So, in the rise of the age of the internet and social media, we see that there are large portions of the population that have become a lot more visibly vulnerable to stereotypes and misinformation and disinformation from bad faith actors who want to promote their bigoted and racist attitudes. From individuals like ourselves and other people who want to promote religious cooperation and dialogues, where does one start with addressing the problematic systems of social media and mis and disinformation towards the general public?
Okay, I have been volunteered by the group to answer this question. I don't know if this will answer your question. I've practically disappeared from social media for the very reasons you're describing. It's emotionally draining, it's tremendously frustrating, and you feel as if you're trying to empty water out of a sinking ship, but it's just flowing in much faster than you can empty it out with your little bucket, And so I've taken great comfort in this slogan you sometimes hear: think globally, act locally. I don't think it's beyond my capacity to correct everyone on the internet who's saying terrible things, right? So to work within your own community, among those with whom you can have direct contact. Those of us up here in front, we have the great privilege of being able to travel and have our words heard by a lot of people. To use that ability wherever you have it to speak truth and to do good. Social media is a wonderful tool for communicating all kinds of things, right? So it's all there, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? It's all there. But I found that for myself personally, trying to use that tool was exhausting, draining, and did not do very much good. I'll conclude with a description of a cartoon that I actually posted on social media because it expressed how I was feeling. There's a man who is clearly he's awake very far past his bedtime, right? His eyes are glazed, his hair is sticking up, and his wife comes into the room where he's at his computer and says, "Are you coming to bed?" And he says, "Someone is wrong on the internet," and he's obsessively writing to do. I don't know the answer to this particular problem. I wish the internet companies would take more responsibility for what's posted on.
Yes, and that's precisely what's happening. There's been a lot of pressure now by the different United Nations agencies, by OSCE and ODIHR that I mentioned earlier, and others, the governments, to put pressure on the owners of Facebook, of Twitter, and so on and so forth, even Google and so on and so forth, to actually hire more people to monitor through algorithms, sort of when you have languages, words of intolerance that emerge, and how to cut those accounts. Of course, once an account is closed, one can restart a new one and so on and so forth. We know that. But there has been a significant decrease. What's the percentage of the decrease? The methodology to find this out is extremely difficult and complex, I'm sure. But there are improvements on social media precisely because of the pressures of governments and individual and NGOs on those owners of those social media platforms. That's the very good news, because the work of training people, as I've participated in through CAICID and I know of other groups, on social influencers, how to help them understand how they individually can intervene to be more dialogical and change sort of the narratives of intolerance in their own small ways. Yes, it's being done and it's increasing, but it's drops of water in the midst of what's happening. So that's why the monitoring from the owners of the companies is a much more impactful sort of approach.
I'm afraid we have run out of time, so please join me in thanking all our panelists. I now invite Professor Kirkpatrick to offer the closing remarks.
Well, all right. All right, there is no conclusion, right? There is no conclusion. Nor do I think that any of us were actually even hoping that there would be a conclusion. But let me say just some things that don't fit together. First of all, just to remind people, there is a Declaration of Human Rights by the world religions that actually came out, how many years ago now, Arvind? More than a decade. I mean, I remember this particular moment because from a phone call that Arvind gave me. It was just an ordinary day, ordinary time. I was minding my own business, and Arvind phones me up and says, Pat, I've just got off the phone with the Dalai Lama, and I've misplaced my phone number for the Archbishop of Canterbury. Can you give it to me? I said, okay, Arvind, you deal in things and with people far greater than I. But what this did when we all met, because we were, how many? A good 400, 500 people who met.
There were 3 conferences.
Yeah.
I think there were 3,001.
Yeah.
And 1,000.
Right, 3,001 and 1,000, and another down at the Palais des Congrès. This was not an easy thing to do, this declaration, when it came out, and there were all kinds of individuals that had all sorts of opinions, but it's worthwhile having a read just to see what can be done at a certain moment in time. And we have, I think all of you, spoken of events. Certainly Professor Loeffler did yesterday with those moments in time here at McGill, for example, in the 1970s. I want to say to people who are here and who perhaps missed some portion of the talks that you can, of course, watch them quietly again in the comfort of your own home, because we hope to have these videos edited in some way or another and then up on YouTube. More than that, we will go forward in terms of publication. Now, the publication will not be the proceedings of this event, in the sense that word for word what was said is going to now be printed, but will be the reflections that all of us will have had time to give and had discussions with each other. I think, again, back to the issue and Patrice, right at the end, mentioned it again, the dialogical, and how important that is. How important it is not just simply to correct ourselves constantly because of not misinformation necessarily, but because the way in which we begin to think of things and people change, and we take little gobbets of information and we put them back onto the blackboard, and we make of them then something else than what they are. So I would hope that we would be able to go back to our own communities, actually, is what my hope is from this particular symposium, those of you who took the time to come, and be able to go back to those communities and say, there is a way of speaking about these phobias that allow us now to challenge our best thought out ideas, and that these can be done in dialogical form with our neighbors. And so who is my neighbor? Well, my neighbor has grown now this year to include any number of people, and I've learned how it is that I can speak about phobias without necessarily screaming at somebody, without necessarily thinking that I have to cancel them and their ideas. So I thank you all, and there's a festival of food and drink down below in order that we can celebrate the end of the 75th anniversary here at the School of Religious Studies. It is a 75 years that we want to be able to celebrate again 75 years down the line. So for those of you who remembered Wilfred Cantwell Smith, for those of you who remembered the issues of comparative religions as they were back in the 1940s and brought back up now to 2023, well, let's just go down, raise a glass and say bravo. Thank you all very much.